So, on September 4th, 2008, Electronic Arts released their next big project, Spore, a life simulation game where you could create your own creature and guide it from a tiny little cell all the way to intergalactic civilization. Maxis, the studio behind Spore, had already made plenty of simulation games. Modern life simulation game, city simulation game, ant simulation game, some more famous than others. But this was the first time they'd ever centered a simulation game around the concept of evolution. Not the Pokemon version of it, but the real life version of it. This would be one of Electronic Arts' most ambitious projects yet, the most incredible creative risk, and one of the greatest franchises in the industry. And it would also be completely abandoned. In March of 2010, Electronic Arts decided to pull the plug. Only 18 months after the game's release, Spore stopped receiving updates. No expansions, no sequel, nothing. I played the game back then, around the time the game was still being updated. In fact, Spore was one of my earliest introductions to video games as a whole. And I have since then returned to the game many times, wondering about the reasoning for this seemingly sudden discarding of it. And today, we'll try to find that answer. This video is kind of an autopsy of Spore, though it's not dead, it's just abandoned. And together we'll discover why. If this sounds overwhelming, don't worry, as I've organized it into an internet-friendly numbered list, so join me on this adventure, this galactic adventure. That'll make sense much later. Part 1. Why make this? Will Wright, the lead designer on Spore, had a deep fascination with astronomy, evolution, and understanding the universe. A fascination that he wanted younger people to experience too.
And it wasn't until later as I started making games that I really actually think of them more as toys. People call me a game designer, but I really think of these things more as toys.
Will Wright, the toy maker, wanted to make a toy that would teach kids about life and long-term thinking. He wanted a game where people would discover these things on their own rather than being told. He wanted to make a game where people would feel less like Luke Skywalker and more like George Lucas, being able to make their own worlds, their own creatures, their own stories. And that game would be called Spore. Meanwhile, in the sterile headquarters of Electronic Arts, the executives were probably looking at the sales numbers of Will's previous toys and then looking at this new toy with dollar signs in their eyes. A stark contrast to the noble mission of the toy maker. The basic idea of Spore had a lot of unique gameplay, including a tool set that would allow players to design and evolve their own creatures. Consequently, for this to even be possible, the team would need to develop entirely new technology. In the early stages of development, this turned their office at Maxis into this wizardly laboratory of alchemical experiments, with Will Wright stirring the cauldron and cackling with excitement. Part 2. Marketing. The very first time the public would ever hear about Spore wasn't through some marketing campaign or a teaser trailer, but rather it was at the 2005 Game Developers Conference. Will Wright was asked to go on stage to talk about an incredibly vague topic titled The Future of Content. I don't even know what that means.
So what I'm going to show you, first of all, is very unfinished. It's kind of held together with, baling wire and duct tape. Got a long way to go, but I think, I can show you enough of it to where you'll get some sense of why I'm excited by procedural methods. And I think it is relevant to kind of, what people have been seeing at the conference here today. We're calling it Spore.
He then proceeded to showcase a very early prototype of Spore, featuring a cell stage, aquatic stage, creature stage, tribal stage, city stage, civilization stage, and a space stage. And people loved it. I mean, they were laughing, cheering, and by the end they were giving a standing ovation and bowing as if Will had just demonstrated telekinesis on stage, which from a game design standpoint, he practically had. The people in this room were blown away by the demonstration, which created a lot of early excitement for the game, and also very high expectations for it. The following years had the game going through a lot of design changes, which unfortunately made understanding the game's trajectory difficult. The gameplay shown at different conferences looked interesting, but each following showing seemed to be different from the previous, leaving people confused about what to expect from the game. For example, a constantly shifting factor was the number of stages. In the 2005 prototype there were 7: cell, aquatic, creature, tribe, city, civilization, and space. In March of 2007 there were 6 stages, with aquatic having been removed. And in May of 2008 there were 5 phases: cell, creature, tribal, civilization, and space, which is what ended up in the final version. The amount of stages kept shrinking. Furthermore, throughout its development, the game had undergone a pretty stark stylistic shift. Cells that used to look more realistic and scientifically accurate now looked cartoonish with big cute eyes. Visual aspects like blood and dragging creature corpses were removed. These decisions were made as a result of a division within the team. Some wanted the game to be more scientific, while others wanted it to be more funny and cute, similar to the aesthetic present in The Sims. The final look they went with was a compromise between the two, the cuter side clearly winning out here. The design decisions may have also come from a desire to appeal to a broader audience, as violent visuals tend to skew PG ratings higher. And while I myself do enjoy the style they went with, I find it quite charming, I can definitely understand why some people would be disappointed by that. If there was a division like that within the team, there's no doubt there would be a similar division among the potential customers. Additionally, even though early showings of Spore had generated a significant amount of buzz, people had no real idea of what the gameplay would be like. People had heard many times that the game would allow you to evolve a species of creatures from amoeba to sentient space travelers, but had no idea of what that would be like practically. The constantly shifting stages didn't help with this at all, as even in late May of 2008, 3 months before the game's release, there were still people under the impression that there would be an aquatic stage in the game. On May 24, 2008, Spore released a video on their YouTube channel titled Spore Overview Video, which showed actual gameplay footage of the game, finally giving players a better glance at what to expect from the gameplay. 24 days later, June 17, they released a free demo version of the Spore Creature Creator that would allow players to design their own creatures before the launch of the game. The free version only gave people access to a limited selection of the parts in the game, while a full version was sold separately for $10. This was obviously done mostly for marketing purposes, giving potential customers a way to invest themselves early on by designing their own creatures, and also showing off this crazy tool in the game, which in turn also created more excitement. However, it had also been said multiple times that the game would use creatures from other players to populate your world. And so this early release of the creature editor also served a functional purpose. Allowing players to make their own creations before the launch of the game would enable that unique online experience from day one. I think this was generally a very good move, however it did come with its own strange side effect. More on that later. People were very excited for the release of Spore. Unfortunately, the launch of the game wouldn't be without its problems. Part 3: DRM Disaster. When Spore launched at the beginning of September 2008, it wasn't a shampooed version of the game. No, there was a stinky piece of mud slapped onto it, a software called Securom, which was included as copy protection. Copy protection sounds like something that keeps customers' games safe, but that's not what it is. It's actually something that exists with the sole purpose of making the company more money by preventing illegal distribution of the product, aka piracy. I don't normally wear hats like this. EA released the game under a policy where the product key of an individual copy of the game could only be accepted on up to 3 computers. So the extent of your piracy could only benefit your close neighbors. 3 computers is already a pretty strict amount, but it gets worse. Some people experienced that the software considered even a slight change of hardware, like a new graphics card, as a different computer, meaning those measly 3 computer slots got used up really quickly. Obviously, this inclusion was met with a lot of customer complaints, which EA reacted to by so generously raising the limit from 3 to 5 computers. Wow, let us all thank EA for delaying the imminent explosion of the bomb that they planted. A real hero. By September 14, 2008, 10 days after the game's initial Australian release, Spore had 2,216 ratings on Amazon. 91% of them gave the game 1 out of 5 stars, most citing EA's implementation of the DRM for the low ratings. Rising to the defense of EA, Vice President of Corporate Communications Jeff Brown desperately tried to explain the DRM as a standard for the industry, citing Apple's practice of only allowing downloaded music to be played on free devices. As if the old kindergarten maneuver of pointing your finger at someone else would be of any help here. He did it too? Even crazier, this DRM system was apparently the revised version of their even dumber plan, which met so much opposition from the public that they changed it. That first idea would have required authentication every 10 days, like some kind of government security protocol. If EA was just that scared of piracy, I wouldn't be surprised if that idea was their scalable alternative to showing up at your house every Tuesday morning to run a couple DNA samples, check on the invisible security cameras they installed when you bought the game, and do a full perimeter sweep of the house on their way out. You know, just in case you'd be up to any buccaneering behavior with their precious copy of Spore. They went through all this trouble just to protect Spore against the scallywags of the 7 Seas, treating their regular customers like criminals in the process. The irony of this whole disaster is that within the first week of its life cycle, Spore became one of the most pirated games, with over 500,000 people downloading it illegally. And Spore is still to this day one of the most pirated games of all time. Mind you, none of this had anything to do with the game itself. Former Maxis developer Chris Harris even labeled this situation a screw-up and a totally avoidable disaster. I can't even imagine what it must have been like having worked on the game, only to watch EA clumsily fumbling around with it this badly. And with that many people deciding to pirate the game, they obviously lost a lot of money, and Spore was off to a bumpy start. With that, you're probably wanting to hear about the game itself, so let's talk about that. Part 4, Cell Stage. The main selling point of Spore is meant to be the creative freedom in guiding the evolution of a species through the different stages, from single-celled organisms to space travelers. I've decided to evaluate this experience myself, so let's cover the 5 different stages. First, Cell Stage. After a meteor hits the planet's surface, it splits into hundreds of pieces and falls into the ocean. One such rock contains your cell inside of it, which would probably mean that what looked like a crystalline asteroid was realistically the size of a grain of sand. But that wouldn't look as cool. Anyways, the goal of the cell stage is to eat enough food that you grow big enough to go on land. Depending on which mouth you have, you will need to eat plants or meat. I had picked carnivore, so my goal was to eat as much meat as possible. The cell stage plays sort of like Pac-Man, where you go around snatching food while trying to avoid other hungry cells from eating you. Okay, let's get away, no. Please, don't eat me, no. Ah, shit, there's so many. Eat the little guy instead, please. No. No. The gameplay is very basic. It's akin to something you'd seen in arcade. Where the cell stage takes a new spin on the genre is with customization. Other cells will have parts on them that you'll be able to obtain if they die. For example, spikes or fins or poison. It doesn't matter whether you killed it or another cell did, they just have to be neutralized. You'll be able to choose these parts when editing your creature after doing a special mating call. Oh my god, this is a bad place to mate. Okay, never mind. As you can see, the cell stage editor is pretty limited compared to its creature counterpart. You can see that there are only 12 parts total, and due to the top-down gameplay, you can only place parts around the cell. Furthermore, you can expand or shrink the segments in the body, but you have no option to elongate or shorten it. So if you wanted to make a really round cell or long snake cell, you can't. As a result, it's kind of difficult to make something unique that doesn't look the same as something you've made before. Though I do like that the positioning of some of the parts matter in this editor, so that's cool. Spikes in the front will help you kill stuff, while spikes in the back will protect you against other carnivorous cells. However, what's confusing about the parts in this stage is that you encounter other cells that have parts that aren't available to you. Mouths that are different, jets that are different, electric parts with slight variations, and while they function the same way as the parts that you have available, it makes for a slightly frustrating experience when you see a look that you like and then realize you have no way of obtaining it. If this was done for simplicity's sake, they could have just added a slider that would morph the look like they have for the parts in the creature editor. But for some reason they decided not to. I wonder if this lack of customization is the reason for Cell Stage being the only one where all the creatures you encounter are created by maxis. There are no player-made cells. Maybe if they had players encounter cells created by other players, there was a high likelihood that they would run into cells that looked very similar to their own, and thus could get confused by it. Perhaps the simplest solution to this was to preemptively create a diverse cast of creatures that looked very different from each other and anything players would create, even utilizing parts that players had no access to ensure as little confusion as possible. I did also see some people speculating that it might be for balancing purposes, that Maxis was afraid that player-made cells would be too strong or complex to deal with and thus ruin the experience. And I just don't see a very strong argument there. Maxis mostly solved this issue in later stages by grouping creatures based on their capabilities. Then, depending on what level the player is at, the game selects creatures from matching groups. Meaning players don't actually meet creatures of maximum power until roughly around the time they themselves are at that level. For Cell Stage, the game could have been programmed in the same way. For example, making sure to select cells with poison or electric parts only at later levels. So I doubt it had much to do with balancing. I think it's quite obvious that the Cell Stage serves partly as an easing in, a tutorial for the later stages. And by later stages, I mean the creature stage. We can see similar mechanics being introduced, like unlocking parts, mating in order to evolve your creature, and acquiring new abilities depending on what parts you have. However, the mechanics are introduced on a much smaller scope, a microscope you might say, with so little space that there's no room for variety. You can barely experience it any differently than your first playthrough. I understand that the team wanted to bring new players in a way that wouldn't overwhelm them, but I find Cell Stage being in the completely opposite direction. It's underwhelming. It's uninteresting. I don't get why they didn't include just a little more variety and interesting playstyles. They must have known that players wanted to play the game multiple times with different creatures, especially when Cell Stage grants an ability for each subsequent level. And it's not like there's a lack of inspiration to draw from here. There's a huge diversity among aquatic creatures on Earth that they could draw from, with many shapes, many ways of hunting and avoiding being hunted. So why didn't they do this? And yes, I know it's supposed to represent cells and not aquatic animals, but I'm pretty sure they diverged from that path a while ago. I wouldn't say that any one thing ruined the experience for me, it was fine, but multiple things quickly add up to a pretty uninteresting gameplay experience. Also, it took less than 20 minutes to complete. Yeah, it's very short, and I wasn't even rushing the experience, which oddly helps to obscure the issues with the stage, as you barely even get to mull over the experience before the game kindly asks you to move on. And I did check to see if I could get a few more DNA points if I ate more meat after completing the progress bar, but I didn't get anything when I did, so I just decided to move on. 4 out of 10. Part 5, Creature Stage. To no surprise, the creature stage is where you get to use the creature editor, which, unlike the cell editor, has a ton of parts to choose from. Although you won't have access to the full selection of parts from the get-go, as part of the gameplay is unlocking those parts. Your goal in the creature stage is to hunt or befriend other creatures so you can grow your brain and eventually achieve sapience. Hunting is pretty straightforward. You walk up to a creature and you start attacking them. The combat uses a simple tap target system with only 4 attacks total depending on your parts: bite, charge, strike, and spit. Bite is your basic attack, charge can only be used from a distance and will damage and stun your target. Strike is the most damaging attack and can hit multiple enemies, and spit is a ranged attack that poisons your target, dealing damage over time. Parts can range from level 1 to 5, the higher the level, the more damage it deals. Socializing, however, is a much more delicate matter. In order to befriend a creature in the creature stage, you have to mirror the social moves, of which there are 4: sing, dance, charm, and pose. Just like with your attacks, your social moves are also dependent on which parts you have. Other creatures will randomly pick from their own selection of social moves, and you have to mirror them. If they sing, you have to sing. If they dance, you have to dance. And if you can't match their level or surpass it, guess what? They won't be your friend. It's the Pose Me minigame all over again, but instead of serving as a fun social activity, it's the trial by fire that determines the future of your relationship. A common thread you'll notice in Spore is that there are 3 paths that your creature can move between. In the cell stage, those paths were herbivore, carnivore, or omnivore, achieved by eating plants, meat, or a balance between the two. In the creature stage, there is a similar duality: hunt, befriend, or do a mix of both. The idea is that each action you take in the game will guide your creature towards one of the 3 paths, and where they end up at the end of a stage has an effect on where they begin in the following stage. Also, the final combination has an effect on the final stage. More on that later. Ideally, you should be able to guide your creature in any direction. So I decided to test this for myself. I had followed the carnivore path in the cell stage, but when I got to creature stage, I wanted to guide it in the opposite direction and make it end up as a social creature. At the beginning, this shift was pretty easy, as most creatures have roughly the same social power. Thinking it would be the most fun if I had different creatures in my pack, I decided to bring one of the cute little leminoids with me. However, things became difficult pretty quickly after. I had 2 allies in my pack by this point, yet I was having a hard time making any form of progress. It seemed like every time I tried, it barely did anything. And that's when I realized that the allies I had made back when I got the ability to were still just as powerful as when I met them. Despite my own creature having evolved a few times at that point, my allies were the same, meaning whenever a social interaction required anything other than singing, they just stood there, staring with a longing look in their eyes. It felt really frustrating, like I was being punished for sticking with the same group of allies. And just as my frustration was kicking in, a random pack of hostile creatures came out of nowhere and went straight for my allied leminoid, like the game itself had sent its servants to come help clear that pack slot up. After they had completed their mission, they took off into the night, as I was left to watch as Leminoid looked upon me one last time before closing its eyes. I was just left with this angry, sad feeling. And to any of you creature stage experts saying that I could have just used my special ability, I did that at a later point and it didn't do anything, which makes me doubt that it would have here. When I get to evolve my own creature, I don't see why my allies couldn't do the same. Even if the game couldn't do it by itself, at least give me the option to. And this wasn't even the only hurdle I was facing. A lot of the creatures I was facing were very frequent users of the pose ability. It just so happens that the pose ability in Spore is entirely dependent on having arms. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but my creature has no arms. I didn't have the pose ability, meaning basically every social interaction where the creatures posed at least once was a guaranteed failure. The creature I made was a nod to Will Wright's creature, and I wanted it to be a tripod with 3 legs and no arms. But I felt like I was being put at a severe disadvantage for doing so. And I know the solution is simple, just put arms on your creature. But that's not very fun. It doesn't feel all that great to play a game centered around the creation of all sorts of weird creatures, only for the ones with hands to be on a level playing field. Also, it makes no sense why my creature would have a harder time making friends because of that. Dogs don't have that problem. I doubt handshakes are that important. And guess what? Dogs can shake hands. I will admit that I got a bit more frustrated by this because both scenarios happened basically one after another. I do still like the creature stage. I think it's a lot of fun and it's one of the only times you get to be your own creature and see the world from their perspective. The creature stage also has quite a bit of work put into the environment. Like I noticed the weather changing to rain at one point. I even noticed lightning one time, which was pretty cool. There are some unique natural landmarks, like I noticed these interesting looking rock formations that I explored a bit. However, even doing that, I somehow encountered resistance, as my creature had a really hard time traversing the terrain there. It was very bumpy, and with anything more than a 10-degree incline, it would run back down like a toddler going down a skate ramp. It took quite a while, but I did end up finishing the stage. However, despite my efforts to end up as a social creature, having pretty much befriended all the creatures I could, I ended up as adaptable. This happened because the game judges any killing of creatures as a skew towards predator, even ones that are done out of self-defense. Like when that hunting party attacked me, which happened more than once. Had I been more mindful of that, I would have been able to end up social, but it doesn't take a whole lot to mess it up. What I had hoped would be a more smooth shift instead felt like trying to turn the wheel of a broken bumper car, where as soon as you let go just a little bit, it pulls in the opposite direction. Overall, even though I had my frustrations, I definitely liked Creature Stage more than Cell Stage. I'd describe Creature Stage as a kind of clunky RPG with an extremely good character creator, and for that I'd give it a 6 out of 10. Moving on to Part 6, Tribal Stage. In the storyline of Spore, your creature has now reached the point where their nest has grown into a village, and its denizens have started to utilize tools. From a gameplay standpoint, Spore had now gone from an RPG to an RTS, a real-time strategy game. I no longer existed as a member of the species, but had instead received a more managerial role, where I got to tell each tribe member what to do. The primary resource in the tribal stage is food. So it's important to send out your little tribe folk to collect food in their cute little weaved baskets. In the tribal stage, you also receive a few extra consequence abilities from your results in both the cell stage and the creature stage. My first ability was traps, which allowed me to place down a trap that would lure unsuspecting creatures and then instantly kill them. It became a pretty useful source of food. And my secondary ability was Beastmaster, which turned me into a ranger, which allowed me to enchant nearby creatures that would aid me for a short period of time. Despite ending up as adaptable when I was originally going for social at the end of creature stage, I actually really liked the abilities I got. They also worked this time, so that's nice. I think it's really cool that decisions from previous stages carry over to the next and actually has some significance. And look, my previous allies from the creature stage carried over too. They're now being kept in my backyard, where I exercise my superiority by kindly asking them to leave their offspring in an open container for me to collect and turn into sun-side-up eggs right in front of their eyes. The goal of the tribal stage is surprisingly similar to creature stage. You have to befriend or destroy the other tribes on the continent. To help you accomplish this, there are structures you can build that each grant access to a new tool. There are 9 tools divided into 3 categories: food and healing, instruments, and weapons. However, you only have 6 spots to build structures on, so later on you'll have to choose. Your tribe folk can then equip those tools and utilize them. At the very beginning, you only have 2 structures available, but more will be acquired as you progress. Furthermore, there's also a tribal outfitter that lets you put clothes on your creature, but it's under this separate menu, which is pretty easy to overlook, I think. It's only for putting clothes on your creature, and you can't edit the creature itself. I did also notice that the clothes did grant some kind of bonus to gathering, combat, socializing, and health. I, once again, wanted my creature to be friendly, so I made sure that it would be good at socializing by giving it a funny little hat. I gave it some armor. There aren't a ton of options to choose from, but I enjoyed the selection, and you're supposed to unlock more as you go. In order to befriend tribes in this stage, you'll have to click on one of their tribe members and they'll start requesting instruments that you have to play by pressing the corresponding button. If this sounds weirdly familiar, that's because it is. It's the Pose Me minigame, but instead of singing and dancing, you're playing the flute. Afterwards, they'll give you a rating, and if you impress them enough, they will become a blue smiley. You then have to do it one more time to turn them into a green smiley, and thus make them your ally. Before going to the other tribes, I always made sure to use my Beastmaster ability. I'm not sure to which degree they helped, but I received straight 10s all the way through, and I have a feeling that my troop of performing animals had to have had some impact on that. I did also enjoy the sight of the row of babies that followed all the way to the show, like a mama duck with ducklings. Occasionally, tribes that appear with a negative attitude towards you will send their raiding parties to attack your village. I even experienced 3 tribes deciding to raid me at the same time. If you're going the friendly route like I was, you can give those tribes a gift that instantly makes them neutral towards you and allows you to befriend them. For some reason, that's all it takes for them to completely shift their attitude towards you. I did read that the effect of the gift will wear off eventually after some time and they'll return to being angry. But the duration of that effect must have been really generous since it never wore off for me. I was able to befriend all 3 tribes without giving them a second gift. As you go up against larger tribes, it becomes more important to have more tribe members yourself. But you might be wondering, where are all the extra tribe members coming from? Right here. This mysterious building. You click this button and shortly after an egg comes rolling out, like a lone tumbleweed, no source in sight. Even weirder, you never see anyone enter or leave the building. There are no windows and the door is kept suspiciously closed at all times. Whoever is held in there is there for the entire length of the tribal stage, which in my case was 3,836,000 years. I can only assume that the 10 pieces of food I paid for each baby is brought to them, but they definitely don't get any sunlight. But then again, I don't either. Overall, I actually enjoyed this stage quite a bit, although I still have some critiques. First of all, the movement for the tribe members suck. Quite often they have a lot of trouble getting to where they need to go. For example, while eating and bringing food, one of them would get stuck and just stand there with a question mark hovering over them. And since the tribe members can't occupy the same spot, the path was blocked for all the other tribe members, meaning I had to go in and manually move that tribe member out of the way. This would happen a lot during combat as well, which is not a good time for it to happen. I think it's due to the fact that there are only 6 or so spaces around an enemy where tribe members can stand. But it leads to some pretty ineffective combat, where a handful of tribe members will be standing there doing nothing but growling or being stuck in some weird charge animation going all over the place. I also experienced this while befriending other tribes, since at the beginning of each show, everyone involved had to walk around and find a place to stand. And with a whole slew of performing animals, there were a lot of creatures involved, which would lead to these awkward pauses where everyone would be standing at the ready, except for this one creature circling back and forth, trying to find the perfect spot. I swear I could almost hear crickets chirping. There was no escaping this issue. It's very bad. My second critique is, it's too short and there's too little to do. Like I said, I enjoyed the experience, but I wanted to do more. For example, I noticed this cool ancient temple looking structure not too far away. So I decided to bring my tribe members over there, but there was nothing to do there. No way to worship at the temple, not even an animation that acknowledged its presence. Nothing. I just went there, took a couple pictures like a wandering tourist and left. I would love to have seen more ways to interact with other tribes, like trading. I'm pretty sure that's a very important aspect of tribal communities, trading food for particular items or land or vice versa. And also more ways for other tribes to interact with each other. I only ever saw this a single time. One of my allied tribes just started fighting a group of angry tribe folk that were trying to chase me, and that was really cool. I would have loved to have seen more of that. It would also have been cool with more ways to build my village, extra upgrades for the tool buildings, or ways to build structures of worship that would boost my tribe folk in different ways. I mean, there's already a staff of healing, so maybe some more shaman voodoo magic would be cool. Why not? Defense against raids would be cool too, like walls or traps, something, anything. As it is, the tribal stage feels too hollow. It honestly felt like playing a prototype. I saw this huge list online of all sorts of game-breaking glitches in this stage, and even though I didn't encounter 90% of what's listed here, their existence really proves how unpolished this stage is, even in its kind of superficial state. Judging by my own personal experience of the stage, I would give Tribal a 6 out of 10, but I liked it more than Creature Stage. Part 7, Civilization Stage. I'll have to admit 2 things before we talk about this stage. Number 1, I accidentally live streamed my gameplay of this stage instead of recording it, which was very embarrassing. But that means that the footage you'll be seeing is from a second playthrough I did right after, but it's with the same creatures and abilities and stuff like that, so it doesn't affect much. Number 2, I'm a weird specimen of Spore player. From when I was a small child playing Spore all the way till now, 80% of my time playing this game has been spent playing the Civilization stage over and over again. Some people have a comfort watch, I have a comfort game. So I won't as easily be able to talk about this stage from a perspective of a new player, but I will be able to talk about it from the perspective of someone who's had like 16 years to sink their teeth into it. So, the Civilization stage. Your species has now gone from a tribal community to a more modern society. But there's a plot hole in the narrative here. You think I wouldn't notice a plot hole in Spore? What kind of human would I be? The goal of the Civilization stage is to unify the planet, which you do by defeating the other nations that pop up. But what you'll notice is that all of the other nations on the planet appear from other tribes that are the same species as us. In our entire time spent in the tribal stage, never once did we see another tribe of our own species. So where did they come from, Spore? I can assume that at some point a group of tribe folk went to settle down in other parts of the world, because that's what happened with humans, but I don't know if that's what happened because it's never explained. Am I really supposed to believe that this important step in the history of my species happened off camera? That it's a Rise of Skywalker all over again? That they were always there, I just didn't see it? I don't believe it. So, your goal is to defeat the other nations that were created from a genetic sample of your species taken by an alien civilization. To do this, you'll need to generate money by capturing spice geysers and building factories in your city. But if you solely build factories, then your citizens will become unhappy and they will start striking. And while they're striking, the city won't make any money. So in order to optimize the city, you want a nice combination of entertainment buildings, houses, and factories. And ideally a happy population, as that will cause occasional celebrations that will double your income. Isn't it cool that the game teaches you the basics of city composition? I think so. Income will allow you to build enough vehicles that you can start taking over other cities. Depending on your result in the tribal stage, your city will begin as one of 3 archetypes: religious, militant, or economic. Unlike the tribal stage, the 3 archetypes here actually feel distinct from each other. They each have their own vehicles and they capture cities in 3 different ways. So let's break this down. Religious nations capture other cities by converting them to their own religion. They do this by shooting their colorful beams of music at turrets to pacify them, and then they block out the city's entertainment buildings, creating unhappiness among the population. This makes the city susceptible to their preaching, which slowly converts the city. It's quite a well thought out plan. Create a problem within the city and then preach the solution to it. It's also really good as taking over cities this way keeps the buildings intact as they suffer no damage in the process. Religious vehicles can also shoot their colorful beams of music at other vehicles. They deal a low amount of damage but can damage multiple vehicles close by, making them stronger against tighter groups of enemies. Religious vehicles can also enchant epics, which can be used as fireball cannons or lured into other cities for fun. Militant nations capture other cities by obliterating them until they are nothing but ash and are forced to surrender. This does come with the side effect of having to rebuild the city after each capture. Militant vehicles deal pretty good single target damage with their missiles, making them quite capable of fighting off other vehicles. In my experience, AI controlled militant nations have the highest likelihood of capturing multiple cities. Economic nations capture other cities by establishing trade routes between the cities. Once you've filled the progress bar, instead of capturing the city, you'll be prompted to buy the city. The city doesn't have an initial price, but rather, like the savvy businessmen, you're supposed to make the offer based on 5 potential prices. However, if you bid too low, the other city will be really offended and will immediately shut down that conversation with you, and the progress bar will start over. Of course, the other nation knows exactly what they think that city is worth. They've known that this whole time. They just won't tell you. And there isn't even an option to increase your bid after you've heard their initial reaction. There's no negotiation here, it's a guessing game. And if you don't get it right from the very moment you open your mouth, you get slapped in the face and told to start over. You'd think the gameplay of the money-centric nation would make you feel like a greedy tradesman, twirling your mustache as you watch your pile of money grow larger. But no, instead it makes them feel like the greedy tradesman and you feel insecure, never knowing whether the price you bid was actually appropriate, or you just spent 16,000 Spore bucks more than you needed to. Economic vehicles are also unique in the sense that they have no way of defending themselves and they can't fight back. They are forced to run away or slowly crumble into ash. Meaning your city's turrets are both your first and last line of defense. That or throwing loads of cash at your enemies to make them like you more, that works too. Consequently, this also makes economic nations the easiest targets and are the most likely to be captured first. And for some reason, other economic nations can't capture other cities, even when their progress bar is full. They'll just continue their trade route going back and forth. I think this happens because the option to purchase a city exists in a different menu that the AI doesn't have access to. But I like to imagine that it's because they keep getting the price wrong. On top of the 3 archetypes being present, you also have complete control over the design of your buildings and vehicles. With the vehicles, you even get to influence their statistics. Different parts add a larger percentage of speed, attack, or health, allowing you to create vehicles that are slow and tanky, great for defending or attacking cities, or ones that are really fast, great for capturing geysers in the early game. Though I will say that I'd prefer if the stats were simple sliders I could drag around instead of being tied to certain parts, as I've had times where I designed a vehicle that looked pretty fast, but in order for it to actually be fast, I had to hide a bunch of wheels and jets somewhere on it, which got a bit ridiculous. Civilization stage also has the most consequence abilities with 9 options depending on your results in the previous 3 stages. My combination included a deployable shield that would make my vehicles briefly invincible, a bribe bomb that would make vehicles turn on each other, and a deployable dark cloud that would shut down turrets and also make the city really sad. It's because of this combination of archetypes, vehicle customization, and consequence abilities that I think Civilization stage has a decent amount of replay value. Certainly more than the Cell and Tribal stage have. It makes you want to try out each of the archetypes at least once, unless you get bored of the gameplay. I think my biggest gripe with Civilization stage is how quickly it becomes a steamroll, even on hard mode. About halfway through the stage, you usually have such a large army that taking over any remaining cities becomes a breeze. The computer-controlled nations have no real way of dealing with large armies, so they get crushed. At that point, the game even lets you skip to the end by quite literally giving you a win button that captures the remaining 4 cities instantly. And if you have a decent relationship with the final nation, they'll let you win by just surrendering and joining you. It's always felt really anticlimactic that once you've fought to the halfway point, that's it, the stage is over, you've won. That feeling of a dramatic final showdown is completely absent, and so it doesn't quite feel as rewarding. Furthermore, as I've also said with the tribal stage, I would have liked to have seen more strategic options in the civilization stage. For example, different types of turrets with unique capabilities, maybe some having a longer range or dealing AoE damage. City shields would have been a nice addition as well, just for some extra protection. I'm imagining it looking like the ones the Gungans use in Star Wars. Even just having a few more options like that would have added some additional depth, without making it too complicated. Overall, I've enjoyed Civilization stage quite a bit, and I still like to return to it every now and then. But I've also experienced its limitations quite a bit. So for that reason, I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10. Which brings us to Part 8, Space Stage. the final stage of Spore. This stage is pretty big and there's a lot to talk about, so I'm gonna break it down into another list. A list inside a list. But this time I'm labeling them with letters so we don't get too confused. Number A promising start. In a game where the scale has constantly expanded, Space Stage oddly brings you back down to one single individual again. Up until this point, the game has been slowly zooming out further and further, and so has your point of view. You'd think the next step would be scaling that up, overseeing a species that spans the stars, guiding an interstellar civilization as it takes its place in the galaxy. But for some reason, when you reach the space stage, you're back down to controlling one character, a pilot. It's quite a significant shift and an interesting design decision. At this point in the story of Spore, you play as the first space captain of your species, and with that you can choose to play the tutorial. In universe, this is framed as pilot training because no one has flown a spaceship before. You fly through glowing spheres, beam up creatures, kill those same creatures because they're sick, a task you'll be very familiar with later on, and at the end you're given the rank of captain. Your empire then reveals that they have picked up strange radio signals from a nearby planet and suspect it might be a sign of life. It's the first of a series of main story quests. When you travel to the planet, you find that the source of the radio signal is a crashed spacecraft. Its alien crew have long passed away, but they managed to draw a cryptic map in the sand before they perished. The clues left here takes you to a different solar system, where you find the ruins of an alien city. I love these kinds of mysteries. There's just something haunting yet intriguing about discovering the remains of a galactic civilization, not knowing whether whatever hit them will soon hit you. Oh, mind flares! Mind flares, oh no! The scan must have triggered the colony's defenses. These drones don't look friendly. Wait, an incoming transmission. Oh shit, we're being abducted by mind flares now. The ships here were supposed to represent leftover security drones from the city, but the game selects a random asset for them. In my case, it had chosen my Nautiloid model, which told a bit of a different story in my mind, but it was still fun. These security drones falsely identify you as being the Grox, a mysterious entity and likely cause for the destruction of the aliens. Afterwards, you are let loose a bit. You set up colonies on other planets, you meet other alien empires with their own personalities and dialogue, which made it quite fun for me to do my own poor attempts at voicing them. That's not what I expected. What the oh wow. For the followers of Harmony, our touchstone is home. With our gift, we are able to teleport to our homeworld to reconnect with our Terra self. So they are shamans, I know that ability. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing. I feel the need to explain what's going on here. Each empire in Space Stage is given a philosophy based on an archetype. To those familiar with RPGs, you can think of them as classes. There are 9 potential archetypes in Space Stage: Knight, Shaman, Zealot, Ecologist, Scientist, Trader, Diplomat, Bard, and Warrior. Your species also has an archetype based on the results of the previous 4 stages. The one thing that separates the gameplay from each archetype is 1, their personality, and 2, their superpower. I, for example, became an ecologist who are all about protecting life and preserving nature. And my superpower was being able to suck a bunch of plants and animals into my ship, which I could then use to protect life and preserve nature. The alien empire I was talking to had the shaman archetype, which are the peaceful spiritual ones. And in talking to them, they pretty blatantly stated, "We are the spiritual, we have the power to return home." And that was pretty much the extent of their personality. Number B, the Grox. Later in the Space Stage, you receive a transmission from a system detailing that a strange object is approaching the planet, and they are afraid that it could be the Grox. I initially didn't make it in time the first time I got the alert because I was doing something else, but I got it again a little over an hour later. Basically, you fly down to the planet and you see unfamiliar ships have swarmed the planet. They're all a part of the so-called Grox Empire. These ships are stronger, but besides that there isn't anything unique about them. They don't really do anything while they're there, and they leave pretty shortly after. It's very strange. Anyways, shortly after, your empire decides that it's time for you to meet the Grox and find out who or what they are and what they're after. Intelligence says that they can supposedly be found near the center of the galaxy. Great, the moment this questline has been slowly building towards. You travel through wormholes to get closer to the center in the search for the Grox. When you finally find them, they turn out to be evil cyborg aliens. And if you try asking them to elaborate, they spend 3 paragraphs of text roasting you, berating how stinky and ugly you are. They don't seem to have any deeper reason than an out-of-hand superiority complex. At least not one that I could find. I find it amusing that the game still gives you the standard dialogue option that says, "That's fascinating, thank you for sharing," after being absolutely pooped on. The Grox then instantly declare war on you and will randomly attack your colonies for the rest of the game. After my playthrough, I tried searching online to see if there was anything more to them than that, but it seemed that every bit of information about them was being kept awfully vague and mysterious. Like, for example, an artifact in the game theorized that the Grox were created for unknown reasons and purposes, and that they are protecting or guarding against something of value hidden within the galactic core, for unknown reasons and purposes. Which to me is just another way of saying we thought about it, but we never actually did anything with it. I just find it to be an incredibly disappointing resolution to an otherwise intriguing mystery. I feel like they could have done something different than "We are the evil Grox that hate everyone," that you're just forced to deal with for the rest of the game and any subsequent playthroughs. Defeating them is unreasonable as they control 2,400 systems. That's an overwhelming amount of systems. I don't know what in the world Maxis was thinking, because that's just brutal. It's possible and people have done it, but it would take hours and hours of non-stop fighting to achieve it. It's a huge undertaking. I've seen people talk about overcoming this undertaking by breaking it down to 10 Grox planets per day, every day for 8 months. Because for the task to even be remotely manageable, they have to work it into their routine like they're training for a marathon or something. And unless you're part of the very small percentage of hardcore completionists, there's just no way you're gonna do that. It's just really bad. If you're only going to spend the time making a puddle-deep villain, at least let players defeat them in a sensible way. Number C, the space routine. So I think it'd be insightful if we talk about the core gameplay of the space stage for a moment. This stage is supposed to be more of a sandbox where you can technically explore the galaxy and do whatever you want. I say technically because in my experience I could do that, but that wasn't how most of my time in this stage was spent. So let's break this down. In order for you to do basically anything in this stage, you'll need money. The primary way of making money in this stage is selling different colored spice to whichever empire is willing to pay the most for it. Now, before you can do that, you'll need to collect the spice generated on your colonized planets. Great, we collected the spice on 2 of our planets, only 4 more to go. Maybe this experience is mildly interesting the first time around, but it certainly isn't the 36th time you do it. For context, my ship had a perk that made it move faster, so this is actually the sped up version, and it still feels slow. It feels extremely unnecessary. There's no in-universe reason for you to have to visit each individual colony to collect your spice. Do distribution networks not exist? Are there no space trucks? There could have very easily been freighter ships that shipped all the spice to your home planet, and then you could collect it all there. That would have been a pretty simple solution, unless the captain you play as is legitimately the only space pilot in your entire empire, which it certainly feels like. But this isn't even the case, since if you establish trade routes with other empires, you can see other spaceships flying back and forth. What's super weird about this gameplay is that it oddly disincentivizes expanding your empire, because the more colonies you have, the longer it takes to collect the spice, and before you know it, that's all you're doing. Obviously, I didn't want that, as I also wanted to experience the other parts of the stage. So once I had a planet with every color of spice, I basically just stopped colonizing. It seems like the design wasn't entirely thought through here. Collecting spice manually this way is tedious, but it works when you only have a couple of systems. However, it completely falls apart when you have dozens of systems. At that point, you begin to waste a lot of your resources, because you simply can't get to that many planets quickly enough. The game really wants you to expand your empire. There are multiple times where the dialogue prompts you to do so, but since the gameplay isn't designed for it, you end up with a suboptimal experience if you do so, which isn't great. Anyways, collecting spice isn't the only activity in Space Stage, so let's talk about missions. If you open up the communication panel while hovering over a colony, you can ask if they have any missions for you. Usually they'll have one, however sometimes they don't, which tends to happen if you ask them too soon after having completed a mission for them. The missions are randomly picked from a handful of types. Most of the time it's fetch quests like bring this creature from this planet, bring this plant from this planet, scan the life forms on this planet, eliminate the infected on this planet. Oh, remember that one? Doing missions gets stale pretty quickly, especially because they feel so similar to each other. Even though you technically aren't doing the same mission over and over again, there isn't much of a difference between finding a creature and finding a plant. It's functionally the same mission. Many of the missions have a visible timer built in that will cause you to fail the mission if you don't complete it in time. It sort of feels like a last-minute attempt to inject some kind of tension into the missions. However, usually you can complete them well within the time limit, so it doesn't even do that. Instead, it seems like it just adds an extra hurdle for the people writing the dialogue, seeing as they now have to come up with an in-universe reason for the mission being time-sensitive. Like, they really need this resource for this research project. In some cases it seems like the writers just gave up and the aliens don't give you any reason. It turns out it's surprisingly hard to explain why fetching a single plant needs to be done by a complete stranger in under 5 minutes. When you complete the missions, you're rewarded with money and your relationship with that empire improves. Beyond that, there isn't much of a reason to do missions. Despite having spent the last few minutes critiquing the space stage, I have still yet to talk about possibly the most tedious part of the gameplay. Sometimes while playing, special emergencies will happen. They can happen on any of your own or your allies' planets, and when they do, you receive an alert. The alert details which of the 3 possible events are happening: eco-disaster, pirate plunder, or UFO attack. They aren't very complicated, so they won't take long for me to explain. During eco-disasters, the planet will have infected creatures that you'll need to kill 5 of. During pirate plunders, a few ships will try stealing the spice on the planet. And during UFO attacks, spaceships from other empires will try destroying your colonies. If this sounds very similar to the missions, that's because they are. One of them is literally identical. It even has the timer. What makes the emergencies so much worse than the missions is that they happen at random. They can happen at any point while playing. You could be building colonies and an alert pops up. You could be finding a battle and an alert pops up. You could be on the other side of the galaxy and an alert pops up, which actually happened to me. More on that later. No matter what you're doing, whenever that alert pops up, you have to drop it and get your ass back to that planet and save it. Because unlike regular missions, emergencies have consequences if you don't deal with them. Eco-disasters will slowly make your planet inhabitable, pirates will take your spice, and spaceship attacks will destroy your colonies, sometimes completely. So if you don't want to lose a whole bunch of progress you've made, you better get over there. Furthermore, in my experience, emergencies seem to happen at random at a per planet basis. My theory is that there's some sort of randomized timer for each planet that gets affected by certain things, like whether you're at war with another empire. Consequently, this means that the more planets you have, the more emergencies you'll deal with. Once again, disincentivizing expanding your empire. And that isn't the only place where this system causes problems. Space State seems to want you to explore and experience the wonders of the galaxy. There are multiple times where your own empire encourages you to do so. Yet here is a system that drives you in the opposite direction. At first the game says go explore the galaxy, but then when you go explore the galaxy the game says no, come back, we need you. It's confusing. And if you don't get involved during emergencies, your empire slowly crumbles. It's like you, the space captain, is the only competent member of your species. Your colonies are literally dependent on you. You're the one who has to come defend them against intruders. You're the one who has to take out the 5 infected creatures. You're the one who has to collect the spice. Which isn't very far from telling you to come unclog the toilet in docking bay 33 on your way out. I constantly found myself ping-ponging back and forth between trying to do my own thing and having to micromanage my own empire. It almost feels like this stage would be much better off if it focused itself on one area, either the space captain exploration side of it or the Galactic Empire managing side of it, like an expansion of the civilization stage. This attempt at doing both at the same time just didn't quite work for me. Number D, feeling lost. Eventually, I had tried most areas of the gameplay. I had tried conquering other planets, as that's something I really like in the civilization stage, and a lot of the games I play tend to be combat focused, but I didn't find it as enjoyable. Fighting other ships was basically just firing missiles while slowly backing away, and destroying the cities involved spamming bombs while hovering over them. It wasn't quite the experience I'd hoped for, so I tried something completely different. I had noticed that there was a tool that would allow you to interact with tribes and civilizations by drawing crop circles near them, and so I did that. I found a tribe and I used the tool, and it didn't do anything. They just kind of stood there trembling in fear, which is understandable, but that's not what the game told me would happen. I then used a monolith to evolve the tribes to civilization stage, and I tried it once again. This time a handful of the citizens walked out of the city and onto the crop circles, and then trembled in fear and ran back. I don't know if I was doing something wrong, but I wouldn't call that an interaction. This tool didn't seem to work, so I gave up on that. Eventually, that species made it to space stage, and they thanked me for transcending their species. But I don't know how much I helped with that, since the tribe I was quote-unquote interacting with was lavender, and this empire was green. In fact, the only interaction I ever had with the Green Nation was blowing up an entire fleet of their planes to defend the Lavender Nation. So if anything, they should be seeking revenge on me or be trembling in fear. Eventually, I just felt directionless. I didn't know what I was doing. Anything I tried doing turned out to be as shallow as most people's reasons for wanting to study business. I knew it was possible to find Earth somewhere in the galaxy, so I went out looking for it, thinking that perhaps if I had that as my goal, it would instill a sense of purpose and unlock the true wonder of this stage. I was at the other side of the galaxy when the alerts started popping up. No Earth in sight. Their pinging sound ringing with the same dreadful tone as the clock telling you your break is over. Deep within the winding arms of the galaxy, I found myself trapped in an endless web of stars. Trapped in the ever-present conflict of the space stage. Should I just keep looking, knowing that in my absence, my empire was slowly falling apart? Or should I make my way back? I had no idea if I was even in the same quadrant of the galaxy as Earth. And so, with the pressure of the eco-disaster timer visibly ticking down, I decided to head back. Had I only been equipped with the Shaman's return ticket, this issue would have been solved with a single click of a button. Instead, I had to manually find my way back to the other side of the galaxy, having no idea which wormhole I went through to get where I was. I did eventually find my way back, but I could tell something was missing. I wasn't enjoying the experience much. At this point I was only a couple of steps away from getting the final medal, and I know nothing extra happens if you complete the progress bar, so I set my course for a fitting end for my playthrough, the center of the galaxy. Getting there is pretty tough, since you have to wiggle your way through a web of Grox planets while their ships try to gun you down.
Greetings, my friend. You have traveled very far and overcome many obstacles. Some of you may ask, who is this mysterious voice who knows so much and possesses such great powers? I'm glad asked.
I'm Steve. You are now to be given the power. Yes, that's right, the power. The power to create and spread life, intelligence, and understanding throughout the cosmos.
That's it. Steve's gone. The tiny robot grants you the Staff of Life and then flies away, and that's it. That's the end of Spore. Well, technically it isn't. There is no end. By reaching the center, you're simply given yet another tool to use. This one transforms barren planets into lush worlds full of life. Whoa. Wow. Interestingly enough, if you use this tool on a Grox planet, they flee from that planet. It still doesn't let you defeat them, as you only get 42, and there are, let me repeat, 2,400 Grox systems, but it is a cool detail. And while it may not be the end of Spore, it was the end of my playthrough. For some reason, the rest of that day I was feeling blue. I remember sitting outside and I had no idea why I felt that way. Maybe it was just me, maybe I was just having a bad day. I'll be the first to admit that Space Stage causing that is a bit of a stretch, but I definitely didn't leave any of the other stages feeling that way, so I'm not really sure what it was. Whatever the reason, I walked away from Space Stage with a strange sense of emptiness. And I think that in a way it says a lot about the stage itself. It's huge, it's ambitious, but it never quite gave me the experience I wanted. There are moments of wonder, sure, but they're buried under repetition, busy work, and systems that feel unfun. For me, it's a 5 out of 10, leaving my own personal rankings of the stage looking like this right here. Ooh. Obviously, this is just a single perspective, so let's take a look at what other players initially thought of Spore. Part 9, Reception. The DRM inclusion definitely had its mark on the early reception of the game. Those who made it through and actually played the game seemed to generally enjoy the experience. People really loved the editors, and letting their creativity unfold in the game was unlike anything else they had experienced. For a portion of players, those editors were the best parts of the game. However, as we've already discussed, the creature editor was already available prior to the release of the game, so some people were disappointed that they'd already paid $10 for the best part of the full $50 game. Those who had followed the game's development from when it was first announced were also disappointed, particularly those who had heard the early pitch and were hoping for a more scientifically accurate game about evolution, as Spore doesn't actually give you a very accurate depiction of evolution by natural selection for a multitude of reasons. In fact, the Spore that we got isn't even about evolution. It's about creativity. And it had been about creativity for a while during its development, yet they still kept trying to have this science connection to it in some of the marketing material. So I think it's very reasonable that some people had expected more from it on that front. There were also a lot of people who expressed similar critiques of the gameplay as I did, finding it unpolished and repetitive in many places. Since the game covers so many genres, players had many different opinions about the game. Some players said that the game starts off strong and then goes downhill, while some people said that the game only truly begins once you reach Space Stage. The main takeaway is that the game doesn't feel great all the way through. However, the critique I've seen the most of when it comes to Spore is one of technical issues. The DRM is just one of them. A lot of players also reported experiencing crashes in game. In some cases, the crashes happened debilitatingly often, forcing them to start an entirely new save file. This wasn't just an issue during the launch of Spore, it is still something that happens.
Let's go out before it crashes and save. Just in case. So yeah, they're not impossible, they're just super rare. And it crashed! And we saved! It crashed!
People also had issues accessing the online features, which, if you remember, was one of the major selling points of the game. Also, apparently if you buy the game through Steam, you won't receive the CD key that you need to access the online features. I've not bought Spore through Steam myself, but I felt like there was something strange about this. When I looked at Spore's Steam page, it looked weirdly empty. Simply out of curiosity, I decided to go on the Wayback Machine to check an earlier version of the site. And would you look at that, an earlier Steam page back in 2017 contained additional information that is no longer present. Interestingly enough, all of the additional information here details the game's online features. Automatically shared with other players, explore other players' galaxies, share with the world. Which means that at some point, likely in response to the customer complaints, instead of doing anything about it, EA just went in and deleted all information about it from this page. Except they somehow managed to do a sloppy job of that too, since still to this day the bottom of the page states, to access online features you must register online. Only one registration available per game. But that's not true, at least not reliably. They just forgot to edit that part of the page. This wasn't a short-lived oversight either. The earliest review I could find complaining about this was back in November of 2013. They changed the page sometime in January of 2022. That is 8 years and 2 months of woeful ignorance. I'm no legal expert, but I'm pretty sure that could qualify as misleading advertising. Even after removing the explore and share language from the page, EA left the system requirements stating online features, which could still give buyers the impression that they exist. And also, if you're not going to fix the issue, it's just good measures to clearly state that the CD key needed for online access is not included through Steam, instead of just removing all marketing copy stating it directly, leaving it vague and up to interpretation. I just find it sad how much this game was and still is just plagued with technical issues. It just seems like for some players there's just a sea of hurdles they have to contend with in the pursuit of trying to enjoy this game. And it's baffling how many of those technical issues stem from EA's mishandling of Spore. Securom just being their Souls boss standing at the gate with Princess Spore locked in the tower, screaming in panic. Obviously, the in-game technical issues were due to the development of the game and had nothing to do with EA. So I'm not saying they are solely to blame here, despite how much people like to see it that way, but they definitely did their share. In many ways, players didn't think Spore lived up to the expectations that had been built up for the past 3 years. However, there was one demographic of players that really connected with Spore: kids. It's something that is sort of difficult for me to measure, since children, especially younger ones, don't leave comments or reviews on games. And even if they did, I would have no way of knowing. I'm sort of reasoning my way to this assumption based on the amount of reviews I see today of people saying it was their favorite game as a kid, or they used to play this a lot when they were young. That, and my own experience too. Like I said previously, Spore was one of my earliest introductions to computer games. And I was a kid who liked this game a lot. It's easy to miss, but I think it makes perfect sense. Spore has a cartoony and colorful style, easy to use editors where you can be creative, and a series of stages with relatively simplistic and kid-friendly gameplay, except for the space stage as it relies too much on reading. What's interesting is that this demographic of players also didn't have any expectations. They didn't see Will Wright's presentation in 2005. They didn't hear CEO John Richello, who might have said Spore was gonna rival World of Warcraft. They likely just saw the box cover with a bunch of colorful creatures and thought it looked interesting, and then were blown away with what you could do in the game. And I think that's meaningful, that despite its flaws, it managed to be a great game for younger people. A demographic I hope doesn't get left behind in terms of high quality games. Part 10, Galactic Edition. Along with the base game, EA also released a special edition called Spore Galactic Edition. You can think of it like Spore's version of the deluxe edition. Except instead of granting access to a bunch of skins or digital goodies like modern games do, it came with a bunch of physical items. Remember when games used to do that? It was originally priced at $80, which, unless I'm wrong, would be the equivalent of $119 today. It's a lot of money. According to some of the old Amazon reviews I found, people didn't think the extra items were worth the premium price. But I'd like to judge that myself. I'll show you the items included because I actually have this version of the game. It's the thing that's been sitting in the background this whole time. So the box art looked like this, minus the dirt on the front. It's an ancient relic from 2008, okay. They could probably make an Indiana Jones movie of it by this point. So inside we have, first of all, this Galactic Handbook right here. It's a neat little guidebook for Spore. For example, it has this little list of the consequence abilities, which is pretty cool because it can be quite hard to figure that out in game. But yeah, it's just a guidebook, not much to say. The next thing we have is this The Art of Spore book. This one has suffered some damage, as you can see. One probably tried to eat it at some point. But this one was definitely a favorite of ours. You can see there's a bunch of artwork on the cell stage. Yeah, there's just a bunch of images and artwork showcasing the development of the game. Like this cool concept art. I remember spending hours just flipping through this for inspiration. It did also come with a special Spore fold-out poster, which I'm afraid didn't survive this long. And also, why do fold-out posters exist? They're just gonna look really weird on your wall with all the fold marks. So, on top of the game itself, the Galactic Edition also came with 2 extra DVDs. The first is this 50-minute long documentary made in collaboration with the National Geographic channel called How to Build a Better Being. I found this DVD quite amusing. It follows Will Wright as he goes around different laboratories, talking to different experts, learning about evolution. And then once every 15 minutes or so, there's a sudden jump cut to some B-roll of Spore. Like, I think one time the narrator talks about how creatures on Earth tend to be symmetrical, just like in Spore, the evolution game Will is working on, in case you forgot. You can tell they tried their best to tie it back into the game, but it just doesn't feel all that natural. It's a good evolution documentary though, with Spore tacked onto it. And I don't feel better equipped at building better Spore creatures because of it, but I do now know everything about evolution. Like the fact that a lot of creature embryos look very similar to humans. We are all connected. The other DVD included is a behind-the-scenes video titled The Making of Spore. It's only about 27 minutes long, but it's quite an interesting watch if you like those sorts of bonus DVDs. Are these items worth the extra $53 though? Probably not. I'd say around $40 would be the most I'd pay for it. But it doesn't matter because it's not sold for that price anymore, and I don't even know why I'm doing this. But I do still want to talk about this making of DVD, as it does shed some light on the development process. Specifically, I want to highlight a specific moment in the DVD that I think clarifies some suspicions I've had.
Spore was a very challenging project because we were trying to innovate in so many dimensions at once. You know, there was a lot of innovative design involved, a lot of, fairly deep technology. Huge challenges in terms of we had all these different genres of gameplay that you go through across the levels, but yet we wanted to have the player to feel like it was the same game, roughly the way the controls worked and the camera and the interface had to feel fairly consistent across levels, even though we're dealing with things like first-person eaters, like a first-person shooter, RTS, Pac-Man, all these different genres have to feel, basically live under the same control system.
I find what Will's saying here incredibly insightful, and it explains why I and other people find the gameplay lacking. The team working on Spore were incredibly challenged. I mean, they had to be incredibly innovative with procedural technology, which had never been done before to the extent that it had to in Spore. It almost reminds me of the way that Lucasfilm had to go about making the Star Wars movies. Meanwhile, at the same time, they were trying to build 5 different stages, which are essentially 5 different games, with utterly different genres. That has to be why the game lacks some of the otherwise interesting looking stages, like the fan favorite aquatic stage from the 2005 presentation. They just didn't have the time or resources for it. Any one stage would have been difficult to get right, let alone getting 5 right in the same game, and in this case, they didn't. The game ended up with 5 sort of mediocre experiences, neither of them having the complete gameplay and polish that people were expecting. That's why, realistically, I don't think it would have been a good idea to include any additional stages, because it would have meant even less time and resources for each individual stage, something that would have only led to a worse gameplay experience. Part 11. Expansions. In the months following its release, Spore received a handful of additional pieces of content in the form of expansion packs, extra add-on content that was sold separately. The first of which was the Creepy and Cute expansion pack. The Creepy and Cute expansion pack came out in November of 2008 and included brand new additions to the creature creator, with 60 new creature parts, 48 new paints, some new preview animations, and 2 extra backgrounds, all themed around being either creepy or cute. If you're familiar with the Sims games, it was essentially a stuff pack, and so to the people who enjoyed the creature creator, it was generally well received. Though it was initially priced at $20, which I think is a little expensive considering it only adds a handful of new parts. The Creepy and Cute expansion pack also didn't add anything new to the gameplay, and thus it didn't do much for the players who were disappointed by that. 7 months later, in June of 2009, Spore received its second expansion pack, Galactic Adventures. Not to be confused with the Galactic Edition, even though that's very easy to do and I should have named it something else. Unlike the previous Creepy and Cute expansion, Galactic Adventures did feature new gameplay, and actually quite a bit of it. If you're familiar with The Sims, Galactic Adventures is much closer to a proper expansion pack. Due to the sheer size of the expansion, I'm gonna split it into its 3 parts, starting with the level creator. Spore Galactic Adventures added an entirely new level creator called the Adventure Editor that would allow players to build their very own levels and share them with the community. Using all of Spore's editors to create the assets, you could put together your very own questline, using different objectives and dialogue to tell a story or create a fun minigame. Players would then be able to play through these levels with their very own space captain, more on that later, which basically introduced a whole new role-playing element to Spore. If you're familiar with map making in other games like Counter-Strike or Minecraft, Galactic Adventures was basically Spore's version of that. It brought a whole new way for players to use their creativity, now also encouraging them to tell their own stories. It wasn't a perfect tool though, it has plenty of limitations that players had to navigate. For example, the amount of quests you can have in a single adventure is quite limited. In order to tell larger stories, one of the ways players bypassed this was to create multiple adventures in one single series. Now, the character you play as in these adventures is your space captain from the space stage. And with that they added some new equipment that came with their own set of abilities. Some were enhanced versions of your basic abilities, while others came with entirely new abilities that would replace your previous ones, like carbonite freezing people or attacking them with bees. This expansion was integrated into the gameplay of the space stage. Now, occasionally when you ask for a mission, they would send you on a galactic adventure, meaning instead of finding a plant as your quest, the game would randomly select an adventure from your collection, and you would play that as your quest instead, which is a much better deal in my opinion. When I had completed the adventure, my space captain received 100 experience points and leveled up, allowing me to unlock one of the Galactic Adventure parts. Each subsequent level will allow me to continue upgrading down that same path or choose a new one. It's a neat little progression system, on paper. In reality, it isn't very well designed. You see, later I played through a different adventure of roughly equal length, and at the end I received 15 experience points, like 7 times less than the previous one. This happened because the first adventure I played through was a Maxis made adventure that each reward 100 experience points. And the second one I played through was a player-made adventure that each reward 15 experience points. Despite the gameplay experience being relatively the same, there's a huge disparity in how they are rewarded. This creates a very inconsistent leveling experience. Normally, most games with any kind of progression system has a gradual curve to how you level. Usually the first few levels take a lot less time to achieve than the last few levels. This is because our primitive little monkey brains don't like to put in a lot of work up front without any reward. So video games get around this by putting a bunch of gummy bears in front of you at the beginning with very little space between them, so you don't have to walk too far to get them. And then, as you continue playing, they gradually increase the distance between each gummy bear, resulting in a very smooth and gradual increase in how much you walk. Galactic Adventures, on the other hand, has you walking with the same distance between each gummy bear, and then once you run out of Maxie's adventures, they push you off a cliff, breaking all your bones, forcing you to drag yourself at a snail's pace along the chasm floor while they feed you mere breadcrumbs the rest of the way. It's not a very enjoyable leveling experience. There's also the issue of weapon upgrades being almost necessary to complete some adventures involving combat, of which there are a lot of. Meaning if you decided to upgrade in any of the other paths, not knowing that you would eventually get thrown off a cliff and it would be really hard to obtain a weapon at that point, you'd be punished for that. Also, not a very enjoyable experience. Some players also don't like how, if you play the space stage, the adventure planets sometimes replace ones with valuable spice on it that they would have liked to have colonized, effectively removing that planet since you can't colonize planets with adventures on them. I don't personally have an issue with this since I don't think the game gives you a very good reason to colonize a whole lot of planets, but I wanted to mention it anyway. The Galactic Adventures expansion did a pretty decent job with the adventure editor, and that part is really cool. However, it did not do a very good job of implementing it into the space stage. It also isn't an expansion that has any effect on the gameplay of the previous 4 stages. Rather, it introduces an entirely new set of gameplay and only slightly improves the space stage. But it's still a great addition to Spore. The third and final addition to Spore was the bot parts pack, say that 10 times in a row. It was yet another parts pack, but this time with a cybernetic theme and of a much smaller size, with only 14 parts. Players had been wanting cybernetic parts for a while at that point, and Will Wright even mentioned in 2005 that he wanted cybernetic parts to be obtainable in the space stage. However, rather than being a purchasable add-on, or god forbid an update, the bot parts pack was turned into something far worse. A code redemption campaign. The Spore bot parts pack was obtainable with a code only available on specially marked on Dr. Pepper bottles, or at participating Taco Bell and Arby's restaurants with any order of a large drink. Afterwards, you had to enter the code on the Dr. Pepper website to get the add-on for your account. This extremely tacky experience was limited to residents of the USA, meaning a large portion of Spore's player base had no way of obtaining this pack. And by the end of 2010, no one had, as the pack was discontinued. Spore had 3 expansion packs and one of them is unavailable. I just find it extremely odd to select the cybernetic parts that you know a significant portion of your player base are gonna wanna get, and then turning that into a marketing campaign exclusive to the US. Obviously they weren't gonna include it in a free update, but they could have sold it for like $5 or whatever and at least made it available, but I digress. It is quite sad that a code redemption campaign became the last addition to Spore, but remember, EA wanted Spore to be one of the greatest franchises, which leads us to Part 12, Spinoffs. Like any poor attempt at making the greatest franchise, Spore had its own short-lived series of spin-off games. The majority of these games were watered-down versions of a single stage in Spore designed for mobile devices or the Nintendo DS, often stripped of depth in favor of accessibility or getting them onto market as quickly as possible. Some of the games took Spore in a different direction, like Spore Hero, which released in October 2009 for the Wii console. Its intro cinematic looks like a scene from Ice Age, but instead of Scrat and his acorn, it's this scruffy looking spore creature and a blue egg. I never played this game myself, but from what I can tell from the trailer, it's about this good egg and this evil egg, and you're the good egg, and then you fight a bunch of evil creatures, and then you eventually fight the creature from the evil egg called Sargator.
Heroes aren't born, they're made.
As long as you're born from the good guy egg. I hope the scruffy blue creature acts as like a Mr. Ping character in the tutorial, telling you to press X to jump. That would be really funny. The other more interesting spin-off for Spore was an online hack-and-slash game called Dark Spore. I'm not making that up, that's the actual name of it. Spore was released in April of 2011 for PC. Interestingly enough, it was released after the base game was abandoned, but I suspect this was because Spore was already well in development at that point. This game veered even further away from Spore than Spore Hero did, being this 4-man co-op dungeon crawl game. You don't make your own creatures in this game, but rather you pick from a roster of pre-made heroes and can then tweak them slightly in a very restricted version of the creature editor. And honestly, if someone had showed me Spore without any context, I wouldn't have guessed it had anything to do with Spore. It's so far removed in tone and gameplay that it feels like the Spore name was just bolted on for marketing, which sucks for Spore as a brand because its identity gets muddied in the process. It makes it seem like all Spore is really about is putting parts on creatures. That's the only consistent through line between the games. What about the emphasis on creativity, the charming cartoony style, the evolution theme? Where is all that? I don't think these games are made for the same person. In fact, I don't think they even live in the same neighborhood. From a franchise perspective, Spore Hero is a much better spin-off to Spore, because at least it feels consistent with the base game. And I can see a kid who enjoyed playing Spore also enjoy playing Spore Hero. Spore, on the other hand, feels like it's intended for an older audience with a taste for a more, well, dark aesthetic. Due to Spore being built as an always online game, it required servers actively running, which are an expense to maintain. Eventually, the player base dwindled to a level in which EA decided calling it quits, leading to a permanent shutdown of Spore servers on March 1st, 2016. While I don't think Spore was a good fit for the Spore franchise, I don't like that those who paid for the game had it effectively pulverized in front of them. That something they spent their money on was just taken away from them. But that's a different and much broader topic. Part 13, Abandoned. So, it's kind of hard to find a statement from EA about Spore specifically. A usual tendency when abandoning games is to do it abruptly and without any explanation, quietly digging themselves back underground, never to be seen again. So instead, I decided to look through EA's 2010 annual report, the document where EA reports about their business. I had to dig through a whole bunch of corporate jargon, but I did eventually find something interesting: their fiscal 2010 restructuring plan. I'll read the paragraph out loud. In fiscal year 2010, we announced details of a restructuring plan to narrow our product portfolio to provide greater focus on titles with higher margin opportunities. Under this plan, we reduced our workforce by approximately 1,200 employees and have been 1. Consolidating or closing various facilities, 2. Eliminating certain titles, and 3. Incurring IT and other costs to assist in reorganizing certain activities. The majority of these actions were completed by March 31st, 2010. Translating into plain English, this paragraph says that in 2010, EA decided to focus on fewer games, specifically the ones they thought would make more money. To do that, they fired about 1,200 employees, closed or merged some offices, cancelled or stopped working on certain games, and spent money on reorganizing their tech and operations, most of which was finished by March 31st, 2010. Now, obviously this paragraph doesn't mention anything about Spore specifically, but I think it's fair to assume that Spore was part of those eliminated titles that didn't have high enough profit margins. The Bot Parts pack had its final run in 2010, and Spore's last significant update was somewhere around March of 2010, coinciding with the completion of this restructuring plan. EA does not publish sales numbers of their games and only has their cumulative revenue public. They don't show what each of their games contributed, making it difficult to gauge how well Spore was doing. However, since the restructuring plan is all about focusing on titles with the highest profit margins, and Spore didn't make the cut, I assume Spore wasn't one of their most profitable games at the time. I believe it wasn't due to all of the factors we have already discussed: the overly ambitious marketing, the unpolished gameplay, and EA's own mishandling of it, all of which would be difficult to fix without a substantial amount of work, which costs money. It's my theory that corporates simply compared the profit margins of Spore to their other titles at the time and deemed that it wasn't worth working on anymore, that it wouldn't be worth the risk to make another Spore game when they had other titles that were safer bets. EA was very risk averse during this time, specifically due to the recession, an external factor that very much influenced their new recipe.
Now, I've got a different recipe for you today, and the one that I would like to propose is a decent alternative to what your accountant might be saying. Start by deciding what's important. Invest heavily in just those programs and cut the rest.
Straight to the point, John. Part 14, Potential. The ending of that Making of Spore DVD I showed you earlier is this compilation of the developers sharing their hopes for the future of Spore, with this really upbeat music in the background.
We're really just getting to that first wave of what Spore is all about. Because it's so much about those creativity tools and about that sharing, we fully expect that this thing really just starts to have a life when we ship.
It wasn't a very long one.
Definitely there's a big anticipation. I'm really curious as to what the world will think of it. There's been a lot of hype and anticipation around the game, so that's a little scary, but I think there's so much creativity and fun to be had in Spore that it can't be anything but a hit.
Can't be anything but a hit. Man, it's a mixed feeling hearing their excitement for the release of the game, knowing how it turned out. There's even this shot of this wall filled with post-it notes with their ideas for what to do with Spore for the next 10 years. They had ideas for a film, a Spore World theme park, Spore-branded food like Sporeos, maybe the bot parts pack should have been hidden there, alien abduction stories, even some more concerning ones like Spore farms in the Heartland. That doesn't sound weird at all. It's very clear that the people who worked on Spore were very passionate about it, that they cared enough to want to do more with it, but they were never given the chance to do so. I found this blog post in 2013 by Soren Johnson, a designer and programmer who worked on Spore, in which he reflected on what went wrong in the development process of Spore. It's an excellent read if you have any interest in learning about the development process that resulted in the game that we got. What surprised me the most, however, was how many of the members of the Spore team that ended up leaving comments on this blog post, transforming the blog post into this Spore development team reunion for a moment, with thoughts being shared about what they've each learned from the project. Quite a few of them suggested that they'd like to give it another go and make a second game. But then I realized that was 2013. That's 12 years ago. And now it was just kind of sad. All of this innovation and learning happened, yet they never got the chance to apply it to Spore, to take what they had learned and make a better game, to make the Spore that could have been. If there's one word that I'd use to describe Spore, it's potential. Spore had and still has potential to be something great and truly unique, but because it wasn't done right the first time, corporate decided that it wasn't worth another attempt. The developers cared enough to reflect on and understand where they made mistakes and wanted to correct them, but EA did not. Despite hyping Spore up to becoming a great franchise, the minute it turned out not to be that right away, they abandoned it. They never cared enough to reflect on where they made mistakes, where they might have had an impact on why it wasn't the big success they wanted. They never cared to imagine the success a game like Spore could have if it was better executed and wasn't sabotaged by their own actions. They had no vision of what Spore could become because all they were looking at was how much money it was making at the time and not the underlying reasons for it. Through the eyes of EA back then, if it didn't generate profits right then and there, then it must be a fundamentally bad concept not worth investing in. And I just don't think that's true. I'm not going to pretend EA is a joy factory or anything. They are and will always be a for-profit business. The decide what's important and cut the rest strategy was selected for a reason, to carry the company through a tough time. But it also resulted in an incredibly short-sighted view on their games, on Spore specifically, a project they had spent years building a foundation for, planting the seed for a beautifully unique flower, only for it to be cast aside before it could even have a chance to bloom. And I think they're leaving money on the table because of it. I think there's a reason people are still talking about Spore 17 years later, because it still has potential. It's unique, it's charming, and it has some genuinely fun gameplay. And for that reason, I think it deserves another chance. Now take it away, Shepard.